everybody. Are you having a good day? Yeah. Woo! I know we're nearing like afternoon sleepy time, but we are going to try to make this as engaging as possible. I'm thrilled that we have such an awesome panel here. And I'll quickly introduce myself, but I really want to spend the time today for you to get to know our panelists from different companies, and we're going to chat a little bit about challenges that all kinds of different companies face in terms of building global products, building for global audiences, and building organizations that can actually pull that off. So I'm Ann Bordetsky. I'm on the business development team at Uber, and I'm also very, very engaged with our Women of Uber community. We have actually Sophia, who's also from Uber. We have Mariam from Netflix. Amit from Accel Ventures, a very prominent VC fund. Elena from Airbnb. Elena, I'm so sorry. And Dawn from Fitbit. So one thing I want you guys to just get ready for as you get to know these panelists is prep your questions. We want this to be really interactive, so we're going to have a nice panel discussion, but prep your questions because we're going to make sure we have time for you to ask the panelists. And we have 2 mics back here that will open up in about 10, 15 minutes. So to kick it off, I would like for each of you to introduce yourselves. Tell us about what you do, your role, a little bit about your company, and maybe give us a sense of, when it comes to going global, what are some of the unique challenges that you solve for in your role and your function? So take a few minutes, tell us about yourself, tell us about what problems you work for in your world.
Do you want me to start?
Yes,
Am I on?
please.
Am I on? Yes. Hi. I'm Sophia Vincent, and I manage the technical program management team here at Uber. So welcome to Uber in our beautiful, huge room here. My team basically, I have a pretty small team that works in engineering. It's it's about 27 people. We get involved in most of the kind of complex cross-functional engineering initiatives. And so those could be, I'm doing a lot of things related, our team's doing a lot of things related to compliance right now. We do a lot of things on the infrastructure side, data and analytics, and we also do work at the top of the stack. Like right now, we're actually putting out a new driver app, and somebody on my team has been helping with that as well. So in terms of going global, I think some of the challenges for us are, I think a lot about, there's the product side of going global. For us, as we've grown, I think initially going global just was a scale issue. I can remember very early days at Uber. I've been at Uber a little over 4 years. And when I started, we would have these weekends, especially as the end of the year was approaching, where we just were, for us, it was just like, can we actually serve the traffic that we're going to have on Saturday night, or our system's going to like collapse in on themselves? So thankfully, we're well beyond those days. We don't really think about those things anymore, and we've scaled our systems in that way. And so now a lot of it is more about like, what does the individual experience look like? As an Uber rider, when you travel, you want to have, you like that sense of having the same experience wherever you go, and yet there are really different challenges in different markets. And like I said, a lot of that for us right now, it can be compliance. So what drivers need in order to onboard in different cities and countries can be super unique. And so then, we have to think about things like, how do we build a platform to make that as simple as possible across all of these global regions, for example. So I don't know if I answered your question.
That's good. We're going to come back to you because
Perfect.
Sophia's working on one of the gnarliest challenges that we have, but we'll talk about it later. Mariam?
Great. My name is Mariam Braimah. I am working currently at Netflix. I'm a product designer there. I'm from New York. I don't know if there's any New Yorkers here. Nope, that's a strong no. Yeah.
Yes, down there. Yes.
Yes, there you go. And I'm also Nigerian. I don't know if there's any Nigerians here. I'll take that one for myself. You're Nigerian? What? Oh yeah, Wagwan. I'm a product designer there. I've been at Netflix for 2 years. I work on our mobile sign-up basically our acquisition team, and I lead the mobile sign-up design side of things. And that's dealing with in-app versus browser, and also scaling up towards larger screens for desktop. And to quickly answer your question around global, I would say most people, I don't know if most people know, but Netflix went global at the start of 2016. And so prior to that, we were largely on the Western side, and I think that we were in London and maybe Brazil. But literally over, I want to say the start of January, we flipped the switch and we're in 130 countries overnight. So I think initially there were things around scaling. I wasn't there for that pivotal moment. I came in 6 months later when they figured all that out. I was like, great. But I think now it's looking at how, not only how our technology scales and how our technology can be extremely personable from region to region, but I think it's also looking at how our content does also scale and what that's doing when it's across regions within the world.
Thank you. Hey everyone, my name is Amit Kumar. I'm a partner at Accel Partners, which is a global venture firm. We've backed companies like Facebook, Dropbox, Spotify, Slack. Unfortunately, not Uber. Screwed that one up. My journey has been mostly on the engineering side, so I'm a local kid. I grew up in the Bay Area. Went to UC Berkeley. Any Bears in the house?
Woohoo! Go Bears!
There you go. Yeah. I was a tech lead at Microsoft, and then I started 3 companies. Which is another way of saying my first 2 companies failed. But the third one, thankfully, we found some success. It was backed by Accel and Greylock. We sold it to Twitter, where I led a lot of engineering for Twitter Commerce. It's also where I met Ann, who's fantastic. And then after 2 years there, I jumped aboard Accel. Accel is a global firm. We have offices in London. We have offices in Bangalore. We're very fortunate to have backed the biggest winner in each geo, so Flipkart in India, Supercell in Europe, and Facebook over here. Our lens is a little bit unique. You know, we work with a lot of companies and typically growing companies, and so when they come to us, they ask for advice about how to go global, and so it's up to us to provide that infrastructure or expertise in terms of, you know, capturing the European market or taking a business that's working really well in the United States and going to Europe, or vice versa. You know, recently one of our portfolio companies asked me about GDPR, what are our resources about, you know, understanding new regulations that are coming out. And so for us, it's mostly about helping businesses which are already successful in one geo think about scaling and growing to more. Thanks.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Elena Grewal. I lead the data science team at Airbnb. I'm originally from New Haven, Connecticut, if there are people from Connecticut.
Yes.
I also went to Yale, if there are any Yaleys.
Wow.
I'm disappointed, but it's okay, I'm representing. Anyways, I came out to the Bay Area for grad school at Stanford and then joined Airbnb after that. I've been at Airbnb for about 6 years now, so have been with the data team from when we were 5 to now we're about 120, so a lot of growth over those years. And Airbnb has been global for a pretty long time, and that's been one of the most exciting parts of the job is being a part of how we have expanded globally and think about building a product for a global audience. Airbnb's mission is for everyone to feel like they can belong anywhere, and so that's a big challenge when we are in 191 countries and people have really different experiences and expectations. And we also think about data as the voice of our users at scale, and so data can play a really important role in helping us to understand how are our users experiencing Airbnb, where is it working well, where is it maybe not working as well, and use that to kind of guide our strategy. And so we've seen a lot of gains by looking at data in different places and using that. So that's really important. And again, enabling people to feel like they live like a local. Diversity on our data science function has been really, really important, and it's something that I've worked quite a lot on. I think having different perspectives to bring to looking at that data is critical for us to have a global perspective. So we have lots of people from all over the world on our team. When I started, we had very few women, and at one point we had about 15% and realized we needed to make a change. We revamped our interview process and made a bunch of changes. And now our data science function has about 44% women. Wow. So a lot of change over that time, and it's been a big focus for us. Again, recently I think we reported 55% of our hosts are women. So you know, having women who can look at the data, understand it, it's really important. And then also thinking about that international perspective is really cool.
Great.
Yeah.
Don?
Hi, my name is Dawn Baker. I'm a Senior Director of Software Engineering at Fitbit. Fitbit's an unusual company in that we have hardware engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, so the software engineering designation is an important differentiator there. I have been with Fitbit for 2 years. Before that, I was at LinkedIn, and so definitely some scaling experience in my background in both of these roles. The area of responsibility I have at Fitbit, where we have spent a lot of time on scaling, is on the infrastructure and the back end side. And we had a newsworthy outage over Christmas in 2014. I wasn't there then. And since then have every year gotten farther and farther ahead of our holiday curve. Fitbit's a little bit unusual in this way also, in that we are predictably, our user base goes up between Thanksgiving and January 1st, and then it stays up. And so we've gotten a lot better at predicting how much it's going to go up through joining our sales forecast to our capacity plans and making sure we build out everything ahead of time, and that we've performance tested all of our applications ahead of time for what we think the expected load will be and beyond that. My teams are also responsible for our backend data stores. As you might imagine, we have a lot of time series data, and time series platforms are not built for production data. They're built for log data. And so we've had to solve that problem ourselves. And as we get into more globalization and data privacy, more and more countries are starting to talk about, hey, if you have user data for our citizens, that data can only live here. And that is going to be, I think, an increasing challenge for us and probably for many, many companies to figure out how to do that, especially if you have a social component to your site, which Fitbit does, where you want people in London to be able to be connected to people in San Francisco, and yet their data can't be in the same place.
So I think we might stay on this user data topic because it's a really, really hot one right now, right? With everything that's happening with Facebook and all of the controversy around privacy and the use of data. Sophia, and then Don, I think I'm going to go back to you and really ask you about how this is affecting your organization. But Sophia, you are actually leading the GDPR implementation. Who has heard the word GDPR recently and has to deal with it? Okay. All right, good. First of all, tell us what it is, just for anyone who doesn't know, and what does this mean for tech companies today? How is it affecting sort of how we operate as global businesses, as global tech platforms? Ooh, you need a mic. Take mic. Yeah.
Hello. So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and it's a new regulation, very broad regulation that's come out of Europe and is effective in all of Europe. Come out of the Dutch, actually. And essentially, it's a regulation around how companies treat their customers' data. It's intended to protect customers' privacy, give them a sort of part of the way I talk about it to people is it's almost like, in the past, I think a lot of companies have sort of said, oh, you're our customer and we own all the information we collect about you. And GDPR is really an attempt to sort of switch that on its head and say customers own their data and they give you permission to use that for certain things which you have agreed to. And beyond that, they have rights to say, we don't want you to use the data for X or Y, just for Z. They also have rights to say, hey, what data do you have about me? Can you give it to me? And hey, I don't want you to have data about me that's from 8 years ago. And I don't want you to share that data with anyone without my permission, et cetera. So a lot of these things, I think, when you step back and think about it, are kind of obvious as a consumer. And yet there are things that, without a regulation like this, a lot of businesses have implemented maybe partially, maybe not at all. There's a lot of variability in what companies have done to protect their customer data. So for me, I've been involved in this program kind of towards the tail end. This regulation came out probably a couple of years ago. But Uber has sort of really cranked up our efforts in the last 5 or 6 months to get into compliance, essentially. I actually sort of see it as a huge opportunity for us because there's a lot of things, when you think about things that could be really bad for your business, having a breach of customer data is a thing that many companies have gone through things like that, and they have long-term really negative impacts for those companies. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's great because it's an opportunity for us to focus on really, as a company, we've obviously spent a lot of time in the last couple of years, year and a half, thinking about our customer trust, our user trust, our riders and drivers. And so it's a chance for us to really put some muscle behind that and think about how we can do that and gain trust with regulators at the same time. So I think it's really timely for Uber, actually.
And maybe going back to Dawn here for a second, like when a regulation like that comes through, because this does happen in tech, and especially I think it's going to happen more going forward, like how do you adapt your data systems, your engineering systems, like to that sort of dramatic change? Is that a dramatic change? And then what do you do when you have a global tech stack that you have to adapt to this sort of regulatory environment?
Sure. So step one is a lot of negotiation with legal on how they interpret what the regulation is and what that means functionally. And that is where most of my time has been spent on this. And the brilliant thing about engineers is they really want to solve every problem. And my role in this has been preventing them from solving every problem because a lot of things can be solved with process, and you don't have to put in place a technical solution to solve it. So for example, there is a requirement in GDPR that you allow a user to delete their data, right? It's the right to be forgotten is the phrase that's associated with this in GDPR. And so someone can request that their data be deleted, and you have 30 days to do it. And that means that if that individual receives a marketing email from you on day 31, they can sue you. And the penalties are heavy from the EU. And so it's very important that their data be scrubbed from the system. And so how do you do that? We have we've had to rewrite our data lake processes so that we rewrite user IDs. So when the user deletion happens, there's no connection between the user and the ID that we store. And you can't go back. There's no way to get it back. And so that's an engineering solution that we had to come up with that is not a cheap solution to do. Now, in the meantime, we have also the consent issue. If someone you can't force them to give you consent. We can't force them to give us consent. And so we give them the prompt, and if they don't give us consent, it just means you can only use their data for things related directly to them. You can't use it in any other way. So we have to have a solution that says we will not use their data and that we can prove that we're not using it, even though it's all stored. So we have a way, we store the user ID in a separate table and do a join whenever we want to do work on it, and have a flag that says that we have their consent or we don't, and only allow those with consent to be used in the join. And we could enforce that systematically, which is a lot of work and not possible in the time frame, and we'll eventually do that. But we need to train everyone to say, hey, this is how you do this, and we will audit it periodically to make sure that people are following the process, and if they're not, we will retrain them. And so we have a process married with technology that helps solve that problem.
I think it's an interesting point that while there are a lot of interesting tech solves, not everything requires a tech solution. Some things are more efficiently done through process and training, which sounds less elegant, but I think can be just as effective. Let's change it up a bit. I think GDPR for me is in that category of like the eating your broccoli side of managing and building a tech company, like things we really have to do and have to do well. But on the flip side of it, there's the how do we delight our customers, and how do we delight a customer base and build for a customer base that is very global, and every country is so unique. I mean, I think if there's one thing you learn from being at Uber, it's that every market is different, every city is different, people's needs and interaction with products around the world is very different, and you have to have enough empathy and understanding to build those products well. So Mariam, for Netflix, what countries do you design for in terms of users, and how do you build for someone who's sort of, you know, a very unique customer in a country that might be unfamiliar to the team that's actually building and designing for that user?
Yeah, well, right now I think we're in 190 countries, up from 130 from 2 years ago. So the hard part is that I'm technically trying to design for all 190 of those countries. At the same time, if you design for everything, then you design for no one, right? And so I think that's something that, to be honest, what we're looking at now is how to get as hyper-local as we can when it comes to the overall experience, while not completely derailing the overall and overarching global approach. I really am a strong believer in the way you talk to people can be the first step in terms of how you can create delight. And I think there's stuff to be said around voice and the tone that you're using and how that scales regionally. So one thing that we're starting to ramp up on our team is to partner well with our globalization team, and those are the people that are around localization, translation, and this thing called transcreation, which is the idea of translating the intent of a statement versus directly translating the words themselves. And so I think what's helpful is that when you're speaking with someone from like Japan, for example, or if you're speaking with people that are working in Brazil, a statement as simple as like, hey, how's it going? What's up? Seeing how that translates and how that correlates to a different form of user delight across those regions is helpful. I would say overall, though, just in terms of designing for a global company, one thing I've been trying to challenge myself to do is to start designing with a different region as my default. So I think we tend to default to what we know, of course. So I'm like forcibly trying to default to like APAC, for example, and specifically I want to get really honed in on one country at a time, or maybe it's a country per quarter. Right now I haven't decided because I'm working with my CI partner to see how we can look at design trends out there, how are they actually communicating, how are they actually expecting businesses to speak to them. But ideally, what I think the best thing to do is designing for the most challenging region first, because I think inherently you do get to solve the problems for like the happier path.
Amit, do you have any advice for us on how to design for global products and global users? I mean, before becoming an investor, you were an engineer, you founded companies, you built products.
Yeah, so I think empathy is really important, but so is experience. You know, you can have all the empathy in the world, but if you don't understand what it's like in a different country or the relationship with your product, it's almost impossible to build the right product or make the right improvements. So a couple examples would be, you know, how Twitter is used in Japan is just fundamentally different than how Twitter is used in the United States. Over there, it's almost part of the national fabric. It's literally their emergency broadcast system. And so understanding that is paramount, I think, to making improvements for the product. One of my companies, the product was illegal in the United States and it was legal in the UK. It was a gambling product. And gambling, you know, obviously has a negative connotation over here, but in the UK, it's just part of the national fabric. There's a gambling shop on every corner, just like we have Starbucks. It's actually like nuts over there. And so we literally moved to the UK and we lived it and we breathed it. You know, when we talk to, I think actually like a really accessible example of this is if you have an iPhone and you're trying to design for Android, the reality is just the interactions, the patterns, they're just different. And if you built a product for Android, it would seem foreign to a very kind of native Android user. And so for us as investors, like I carry an Android phone and an iPhone for me to properly evaluate companies which might be Android first. And I recently met someone who's building a community product for K-pop fans, which is cool. And I challenged this person to move to Korea because ultimately, you know, I said, well, isn't most of your audience over there, even if it is a global phenomenon? And, you know, like no investor is going to take you seriously if this thing isn't like rocking in Korea. So like, why don't you like, I'm not asking you to move there for the rest of your life, but like, if you're really serious about this product and this mission, why wouldn't you consider moving there for 3 months? Korea is kind of amazing. So, anyways.
Cool.
And what happened?
Stay tuned. I'm gonna find out. I'm gonna find out.
Elena, I think for Airbnb, what's interesting is, Airbnb has been so global from literally day one. So I'm really curious to hear, are there unique challenges for Airbnb in terms of starting global, but then sort of deepening that, the global context, or have you guys just got it, and maybe you can give us your, lessons learned and hot tips for all the other tech companies struggling with that?
Well, the challenges have definitely evolved over time. When I joined in 2012, we were actually facing off against a clone of Airbnb called Wimdu, which is founded by these brothers called the Samor brothers, who create clones of tech companies. And so at that point, we were actually quite focused on Europe because that's where Wimdu was based, and we were kind of going head-to-head with them in Europe. And we definitely took the approach of having boots on the ground and having people who really understood that market. So we had quite rapid expansion in terms of our operations and offices in Europe during that time so that we could really understand what was happening in that market and have that personal touch. And so that was kind of the challenge at that point. And since then, Wimdu is no more, and so that's great. And we're in 191 countries. Actually, I don't know if that's 100% true, but Airbnb has done really well in Europe, so it's less of a focus. It may still exist. And now we are in so many more countries and have new challenges. And so I think it's kind of a two-pronged approach. So we'll look at data, of course, to understand, are there opportunities in certain countries? We have offices and people from all over, so that helps a lot in terms of saying, for example, we have a very large payments processing aspect to Airbnb and have about 70 currencies, and different countries use payments really differently, and so that's like a very important thing to localize. So for example, Brazilians pay in installments for many things, which I had not known, but we have a Brazilian data scientist on the team who knew that and was like, of course that's the case. Brazilians pay for installments for everything. So that might be something that is a feature level customization where we think about a particular location and change how we do some aspect of our product for that location. And then we've also taken more recently an approach where combining data to understand how users are looking at something differently, and also just strategic considerations. Data is always one piece of the decision making, and that's the right call. It's not always giving you the full picture. To actually start Airbnb in China, and we launched our brand in China last year, IBing. And we have an office in Beijing, and that office is operating like Airbnb 2.0 in China and has a fully built out product team. And the idea there is that they can be on the ground, be looking at that market and designing Airbnb specifically for the Chinese market. And we have a lot of traction in China, which is really exciting. And that's been another type of approach where it's actually like putting a whole product team there. And so again, it really is something that we evolve over time depending on the needs that we see.
If I have one tip that I can offer is befriend your data scientists in your company, no matter which function you're in. Woo, yes. Because honestly, I think not only the access to the data, but working with a team that can truly sort of analyze very challenging problems and pull data from different systems in your company, it's invaluable because the bigger you grow, the harder it is to access that data, access it in one place. And I think I've had phenomenal experiences working with different data scientists to really attack and analyze problems. And it's such an important function, I think, in different types of companies. So we are ready for questions. So if you have questions, please come up to one of the two mics here. Don't be shy. You've heard a lot today. I'm sure there's some pointed questions that you'd love to ask or things that you want to learn from our panelists about their functions and companies. So we're going to open it up for questions. Go ahead. So please introduce yourself, by the way. Give us your name and who you're with, and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Janani. I work for Uber. So I have a question which is open to any of the panelists, and I want to get an idea from both people who are from the investment side as well as from the company. So for any company as they expand, there are two kinds of strategies that they can follow. One is be the first in the market in any of the markets, or mature in one market and then move on to the others. So different companies have followed different strategy. For example, Amazon followed the second one, and Uber or Airbnb followed the first one. So is there any general guideline or any patterns that you have observed in the industry based on, for this kind of a product or this kind of a company, this strategy works best? So what is your thoughts on that?
Amit, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing that I would find similar between Uber and Airbnb is their marketplace dynamics there. And so to some degree, in this example, if Wimdu had kind of dominated the European market before they had gotten there, it'd be much harder to dislodge them. And so I think to some degree you have to kind of figure out if yours is what kind of market it is, if the first person there is going to dominate. I think Uber and Lyft had a kind of a similar fight when it came city by city. But if you were to look at like the scooters, literally like there really is no loyalty between the kind of e-bikes or e-scooter market right now. And so like I don't care if it's a Bird or a Spin or a Lime bike, I'm just going to get on the one that's near me. So in that case, maybe you would make sure you have your kind of system working in one metro before going to the other ones. And so I just think it depends on the kind of market by market what you're trying to do.
I think I would add also for Airbnb, travel is something that is a global thing. Like a lot of people want to travel to different countries, and so if we had been only in one country, we would have been missing a really big market. So that again, speaking to that point of what's your business model, what do you need to delight your customers, and if you actually do need to be global for your customers to want to use you, then that's important.
Thanks. Anyone else?
I just had a question about kind of the GDPR that you kind of mentioned. So you mentioned that provision to kind of, the ability of someone to have their data be forgotten, right? But how do you think that kind of extends to any insights or any model built on that data? Do you think that's kind of a gray area, and how do you think companies are going to address that?
Do you want to go or do you want me to go?
You can both go. Take turns.
We've been thinking about this a lot. One of the interesting things about new regulation is it's pretty open to interpretation. It's usually not super specific, and you haven't seen the regulator enforce it yet, so you are operating at a little bit of a disadvantage. And and again, you're working with legal, as she points out, who kind of have their interpretation. For us, our assumption has been that if we've trained models on your personal data, and it's kind of beyond the retention policy we have, or beyond, or you've asked to be deleted from the model, that we would actually want to pull that data out of the modeling. But the how-to of doing that, particularly on a user-by-user basis, is pretty complicated. On the model side, from a retention perspective, it's relatively easy to say, okay, well, we just won't train any models beyond this retention, or we'll have that discussion with the regulator. On a user-by-user basis, it's more complicated for sure, technically. So, do you have anything to add on yours?
Fitbit is in, I think, a slightly different position than Uber, because if you have a Fitbit and you've had it for 5 years, you can go back 5 years into your data because it's there, available to the user. So it's part of our product. So our retention policies are in line with what our users expect of our product every day. And so we have it slightly easier there, because if our user says, delete me, they get deleted from the whole thing. And that means that any new work that we do on the data, they just won't be in there anymore.
I think we might have time for one more. Go ahead.
I have a background as a linguist. So, every time that I think of globalization, the first thing that comes to mind is how language is important when you are translating to new markets. But based on what you guys are talking about, it seems like it's not one of your major problems here. So any of you guys would like to tell me, what's the role of language in globalization, how big it is?
Mariam?
Perfect question for you.
Yeah. I love it. That's so the role of globalization, I want to make sure I'm getting your question right. We want to understand the role of globalization in terms of the overall process that I take in terms of designing.
The role of the language, translation.
Yes.
It's not just translation and
No.
interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
The role of language compared to all the other problems that you've been talking about, such as data and many other things.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I view that as the #1 experience. I made this joke that I heard from somebody else, where if you get on any website and you show a picture of a website and you remove it remove any language, any words on there, would you be able to recognize the product? Most often you wouldn't. Like you take Google, for example, you wouldn't even know what it is. It's just a box in the middle of the screen, right? Words are everything. Words are the start of the experience. So often when I'm kicking off a project, I try to start with our copywriter and our globalization team because I think it's important to everything that we do. It's the personality, it's the thread of the entire experience. So I 100% am with you in terms of globalization. I think what's been interesting and what I think the challenge is how do you create at scale? And like that's something that's, I think, if you know anyone that's doing that well, I would love to speak with them because I think of McDonald's, for example, I'm loving it. It's transcreated across regions, right? But that's one phrase. When you're looking at an entire sign-up flow, we have lots of strings. We have different payment options that are being offered. And so like we're trying to get better at that while also injecting personality. So the easiest way that we've noticed is to get the bare minimum of localization is if you're creating a standard tone that is like almost as if a robot is speaking to you. But then at that point, the experience suffers, right? So I think it's something that, especially as we're getting into voice UI, conversational UI, all of those types of things, it's something that's definitely coming to the forefront. UX writers, copywriters, globalization, all of that is huge. Did that answer your question?
One more? Go ahead.
Right. I have a question about how to break the Silicon Valley bubble when design a global product. So I've seen in a lot of cases how this works is the PM want to design a new product, and then we interview 50 people from San Francisco, and then we pull data from San Francisco because we only have data for San Francisco, and then we run experiment in San Francisco because we only have infrastructure for that, right? And then we generalize to the entire world without really understanding, you know, people are different. Many places in the world, people use really old devices. They don't even speak English. But, you know, it's very hard because we don't have the data, but how do we actually have a global mindset at a very early stage of product?
God, this isn't fair. We work together, so I don't know if you like set me up. He is my data science partner, so I'm doing a good job of, you know, staying aligned. Yeah, and a former Uber employee, but we can't say that. He's in that place. Personally, and we've discussed this, so I'll talk to the rest of the crowd. Personally, what I've really tried to do within our team is working with our UX research team, as well as the globalization squad, to get people to start thinking outside of the Silicon Valley bubble. And part of that is just user empathy videos, just seeing people using your product that are not based in the United States, that aren't speaking English. One of the things that we've been trying to do as a design team is designing all of our prototypes, wireframes, whatever, in a different language first. So that automatically gets you out of, hey, this is an English only, this is a Silicon Valley only approach. I think the other part of it is working with the CI team to have them surface anything that's going on with our users, our global users, to the larger team. Because there's the design team, which I think aims to be empathetic, and I would love to say the same for engineering, but I think not everyone has empathy at the forefront of what they're doing. It is very easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day of it, and like, you know, it's like, I'm business development. No offense, I think you guys are globally minded, but business development is just trying to get deals, which largely are happening in Silicon Valley, right? And so like, I think it's just constantly reminding your partners, hey, we are not the main users. There are users that literally, for Netflix, 51% of our customers are outside of the US. So they're just constantly reminding them in that way.
Thank you for the questions. We're going to try to wrap up. I see Tuan in the back there, so we're ready. But I think while we have you here, I definitely want to make sure we glean your wisdom about what it takes to really solve problems, because we've talked a lot about global challenges, different types of global challenges, you know, in different functions. But I think you learn a lot in going through this about what it takes to solve complex problems in general. So I'm going to put you on the spot and maybe a little bit of popcorn style. Like, what is your number one advice about how to tackle a really tough, complex problem? And because I think there's different modes of thinking and approaching it, and you probably each have your own. And I think that'd be a really interesting thing for us to learn from you on this panel. Sophia, do you want to go first? How do you approach solving complex problems? Really quickly, what's your top advice?
I really think about it as pattern matching, I guess. I tend to break things down into small pieces because it's usually seems a lot less complex when you break it apart. So I guess that would be my...
Break it apart. Okay, Mariam.
Oh man, you took my answer. Can I say +1?
+1.
Yeah, +1.
I would say that there's, typically engineers, we have like a tendency to just start building things, and that's where our reflex is. And so my advice is really deeply understand the problem. I can't tell you the number of times we met a company who didn't really understand the problem they were solving for, and you end up falling in love with a solution. To give a terrible sports analogy, it's like trying to run upfield before actually catching the ball, and just make sure, I would just say every minute you spend really deeply understanding the problem, talking to more people, is worth 100 minutes down the road about building the solution for it.
You guys totally took my answers. I was going to +1 segmenting your data and breaking it down. I'd also want to +1 asking the right question. If you haven't heard of the 5 whys, I think that's a really great exercise to understand what are you actually trying to solve. So keep asking why to get to that root of the problem. And then, one of the mottos that I like to say is mission before metrics. And so, think about what is the problem and make sure that that's coming first as you're thinking through the solution.
So since a lot of people spoke about the ability to break down a problem, which sounds like a problem that you are trying to do something new to address, half of my world is addressing a problem that came up in an emergency. You don't know where it's coming from or how to solve it. So for that, it is change one thing at a time, because if you change too many things, you have no idea what the solution was. And to collect data about every time you make a change so that you understand deeply the ripple effects of it.
Awesome. See, you guys do know your stuff. So Dawn, Elena, Amit, Mariam, Sophia, thank you so much for your time. This was great. Everyone, please give them a big round of applause.